Hello, everyone. This is Orko Chattopadhyay. I teach in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences in IIT Gandhinagar in India. And welcome to this paper presentation on Ashish Avikuntak's cinema and the trope of death in Ashish Avikuntak's films. Let me just share my screen so that you all can see the slideshow, and we will begin then. Right. So this is the title of my paper, Circles of Thanatos in Ashish Avikuntak's Cinema. But before we go into the philosophy of death embodied in this Indian auteurs' experimental films, let me very briefly talk about the kind of relations between cinema and death that have been theorized in a certain philosophical direction, if we think of a philosophical direction within cinema studies. Discussing human bodies as they appear in cinema, Gilles Deleuze, the French philosopher, approaches Alain René's films in terms of a movement between two deaths. And René's Lazarus like heroes are born from the dead. What defines their life is the passage, right? This passage between a death from the inside and another death from the outside. The cinematic subject, journeying through the ruins of Hiroshima and Auschwitz, hovers between the past of death from the inside and the future of death from the outside. What lies between these two temporalities of death, for Deleuze, forms, I quote, a moving life by colliding the internal sheets of memory, again a quote from Deleuze, with the external layers of reality. These flashes of life between two deaths mark the movement of the cinematic body. But as Deleuze insists, this way of approaching death in cinema goes against any cult of death, what he calls a cult of death, by making death return to life. So it's a question whether cinema can show death as being completely uncoupled from life, or does death necessarily need to be shown as something that is intrinsically related to life, in fact, an extension of life? This is one of the central questions we will come back to. Now, when we consider, as I said, cinema studies' approach towards death, we have very different set of works. For example, we could think of Michel Aren's book, Death and the Moving Image, which develops arguments along iconographic and affective lines. So, death as a cinematic theme has often been genre packed into horror or noir or crime thrillers and so on. At one level, cinema as an art form expands what we could call the cultural imaginary of death. It gives new cultural languages to death by offering uh, 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 generationally resonant images of self-endangerment and suicide. This is Aaron's argument, the way he seems to go about it. Uh, as the Heidegger of being and time knows, any theory of Dasein, being there, is incomplete if it cannot account for death. In a 2010 book on death in Hollywood cinema, Boaz Hagen comments, and I quote, "In some cases, it is argued that cinema is essentially related to death. In others, that it vanquishes death and enables mortality." Now, if the cinematic machine imports deadness in the sense that the moving image, ironically, is a dead image, the technology of recording ensures that we can relive the past. The time of shooting is already a dead time by the time the film releases. If this creates a continuity between cinema and death, the disjunction is noted when screen memory outlives the actors. Cinematography thus has this antinomic relation with death. Now, as I said, I mean, are the moving images dead or are they alive? Laura Mulvey, for example, in Death 24 into a Second in 2006, she writes this book and she asks this question in this book. The answer to the question, what is cinema, should also be, and I quote, the photograph's freezing of reality marks a transition from the animate to inanimate, from life to death. But Malvi also argues that cinema is not an unproblematic expression of life without death. According to her, cinema fosters, and I quote, an illusion that animates the inanimate frames of its origin. Let's underline the word illusion. It's not the reality, according to Malve, but an illusion. Cinema thus hides its own deadness by way of making the images move, as it were. We will see what happens when cinema starts to unhide this deadness of its essential semantic unit, the image. Uh, let's come to Ashish Avikuntak now. This is a picture of Ashish Avikuntak, the Indian auteur filmmaker I'm going to focus on. Avikuntak's cinema is part of what is usually called this particular movement in Indian independent cinema called cinema prayoga. Prayoga, which means practice. This particular idea was, in a way, developed by the film critic Amrit Gangar, who called a set of filmmakers like Ashish Vikuntak, Amit Datta, and others as practitioners of cinema prayoga. Now, if we think about cinema prayoga, it in a way takes after the film society movement that happened in India in the 1960s, the so-called Indian New Wave in the 60s and 70s, and it takes after auteurs like Manikal, Kumar Sahani, and Sham Benegal. Especially Manikal is a particularly relevant reference point for someone like Ashish, who very much takes after Kaul's idea that cinema as an art form, not necessarily as a commercial practice, cinema as an art form is temporal. In fact, when we go into the industry system, the star system, when cinema gets commercialized, in fact, it becomes a visual medium. The commercialization makes it into a visual medium and partially detemporalizes it. So, auteurs like Manikal, and I would say by extension, someone like Ashisha Vikuntak, wants to retemporalize cinema, wants to, in a way, emphasize the temporality of cinema over its visuality, right? Not to completely, go away from the visual, but pressurize the visual with the temporal. And in a sense, that creates a certain association with death. So Gangar, for example, calls it a touch of time, samay sparsha in Hindi. In an interview, he talks about this expression in relation to cinema prayoga. Now, what I would say is that if cinema prayoga is so centrally focused on temporality, that in a way extends into a relation with death, insofar as death is an agent of time. Death, whether it's subjective or objective, whichever way we see it, death happens in time, is the end of subjective time. And also, again, if we think of the practices of death, the question of time is absolutely central to death. I mean, if we think about cemeteries and the tombstone, what is written there is the timeline, the date of birth and the date of death, the year of birth and the year of death. So, in a way, the the cinema prayoga's focus on time in a sense creates a certain focal point when it comes to death. uh, Ashish Avikuntak himself has talked about his own experiences of death, especially in and around his early films like the Kalighat Fetish. So he has, you know, given us reminiscences of how he would go to the Kalighat temple in Kolkata, the city he grew up in, and see buffaloes being sacrificed as part of the worship. He also notes how he was fascinated by these rituals, the daily rituals of sacrifice, even though he abhorred them. While we will return to this point when we read his films, because there's a very strong ritualistic presence of death there, let me also mention here Avikuntak's other exposure to death. And he says, I quote, during my high school studies, I volunteered to work for about 2 years at Nirmal Hridaya, the home for the dying, run by Mother Teresa's missionaries of charity. So that's again a very important experience. And he says, it is here that I encountered death very closely when I saw inmates dying before my eyes. In a way, I think what we are talking about here is this very important personal encounter with death as well. Now, I'm going to talk about two short films from the earlier part of his career and two full-length films. Uh, and the focus in these two short films is essentially how Avikuntak seems to ritualize death. There's a very strong emphasis, I think, in these films when it comes to ritualizing death. So this is the first film that you can see here, uh, Performing Death from 2002. And again, what we see in the first half of this film, which is titled The Dead, uh, is various blurred shots, as you can see, handheld blurred camera shots of the Park Street Cemetery in the city of Calcutta. And this old colonial cemetery is depicted. In the second half of the film, we come to this particular scene, and of course, recurrences of this particular scene, where we have this particular festival, the Durga Puja, the Durgotsav in Calcutta, and we have a Dhunuchi Nach, a particular kind of dance, a worshipping dance, which is being performed by an artist, and it's full of movements. So this second part of the film is called the non-dead, the living, as it were. So Avikunta clearly again puts death and life into a dialectical relation without uncoupling them from each other. What we have is stasis primarily in the first half, in the graveyard, and what we have is a sort of an accelerated movement of life, as it were, in the second half of the film. It goes without saying that there's a certain contrastive relation between the two. But I also want to briefly highlight, as we can see in the second image here, uh, there's a certain mobilization of writing. The inscriptions on the tombstones, which are, of course, very difficult to read here, as a certain way of talking about death. This mobilization of writing to talk about death is something that comes back. For example, in the second film that we are going to briefly touch upon, Vakratunda Swaha, again a short film from 2010. And this particular film, as you can see there, has this very important personal context, that it is about Avikuntak's friend, the late artist Girish Dahiwale, who committed suicide. And in this 21-minute short film, the most pivotal scene perhaps is this particular scene of the immersion of the Ganesha idol in the river Ganges by the Hiwale. And then we have again a certain mobilization of writing, as it were, as the caption says. I shot this sequence of Girish Dahiwale on Anant Chaturdashi, 1997. Girish committed suicide a year later on 18 September 1998. So this personal context of memory is very important, memory and mourning, as it were. And the rest of the film uses this particular mask trope to, in a way, imitate a totemic figure of the Ganesha and show us the traces of mourning and how the mourning, in a way, resurrects the dead, as it were. It's also interesting that this shot, for example, in the third still image that you can see here, is a reverse shot, where if you look carefully, the traffic is going in reverse, and this reverse shot is a very common technique of Avikuntak when it comes to showing a certain reverse temporality, as it were, which has its own relation with death. Now, very quickly, if we come to the full length films, what we see in the full length films is a movement, as it were, from the ritualization of death to a kind of verbal mythologization of death. Now, Kathopanishad goes into this very detailed verbal exchange between Yama and Nachiketa, and that's how he seems to present through Hindu mythology, as it were, the trope of death and the journey of Nachiketa to the abode of death, Yama being the god of death, as it were. This metaphysical transcendental commentary, and this is one of the central points I'm trying to make, as it were, thematizes death and shows us how difficult it is to show death in the filmic language. There's a movement away from the structure of cinema, the techniques of cinema, when it comes to representing death. Avikuntak seems to go by the verbal and the thematic way rather than the structural and the technical way. You know, having said that, this is an interesting film in terms of temporality again, because the first 17 minutes of the film, they're shot in 32 frames per second, next 58 minutes in 24 fps, and the final 2 minutes in 72 fps. The first is Nachiketa's movement towards Yama. The second is Yama's imparting of knowledge, the knowledge of immortality, which in a way cancels the death of the individual, as it were. Sorry, the death of the self is very much there, but the death as a reality, as it were, vanishes. So thematically, it's also a kind of a movement against the reality of death itself. And the third part comes to this modern day Nachiketa. Again, this is a reverse shot, as you can see, and you know, this very brief sort of foray we have into the modern day Nachiketa here. Now, the final film, the fourth film that I want to briefly touch upon is called Rati Chakra Vuha from 2013. And again, it's a single take, full length film which talks about all these newly, you know, married couples, and they're in a sort of, you know, chakrik sort of position, as you can see here, and the rotating camera observes them throughout, as it were, as they talk about life and death. So again, there's a very strong verbal mythology of death, if you think about it, in this particular film. But there's also a very interesting, you know, cinematization of that, once again through the captions, as it were. You know, at the end, after this long, you know, single take film, which goes into the speech of each of the characters, and the camera rotates accordingly. It's not that it always shows us the character who's speaking, sometimes it's focusing on another silent face as it is listening. Nevertheless, when the camera finally ends its rotation, we have this particular caption which says, in bilingual terms, in English, it says, soon after they committed mass suicide. It is not important to know why they killed themselves. It is not important to know how they killed themselves. It is only important to know that they don't live in our midst. They're all dead. There's a certain phenomenological dimension that comes in terms of the very facticity of death, more than the rationality, the reasons behind it, and so on and so forth. I would like to finish here, but the the chakric movement of camera, which is a certain rotation shot, in a way also makes death inexistent by implying an infinity, as it were. It might seem to us that this is a cult of death. This is perhaps the closest Avikunta comes to a cult of death in his cinema. But having said that, if we go into the nitty-gritties of the thematic dimensions of Rati Chakravuha, we would see how this mass suicide is a political commentary on life, not on death. And Avikuntak does not uncouple death from life. So again, he stops on the very verge, I would say, of the cult of death. Thank you so much.